Game over, man. Game over.
Johnny. You're gonna need a bigger boat. So serious.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Oh, welcome to this podcast review for October 28th, 2024, and I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brennan Cassidy.
Hey, thanks for joining us for this conversation as we get into the world of politicking and elections and everyone's favorite activity.
And God.
And God, yeah.
Yeah.
I guess God is a part of it as well, sort of.
Yeah.
In a way.
Yeah, sort of.
On the
yeah.
surface,
bit
perhaps.
of a bait and switch there.
A little bit. Yeah, I'm sure we'll talk about that. So we have a couple of reviews this week, and I'm excited to get into both of them. Obviously, on this episode, we are talking about the film Conclave, which made its wide release this last weekend. We'll have a review for Venom: The Last Dance coming soon. And while that was certainly the more mainstream of the two films, I feel like I've seen more conversation around Conclave right now. Now, part of that is the bubble that we're in terms of critics and the cinephiles and friends that are in the same space as us. But this is a film that is percolating in terms of the awards season, and I think people are just having a lot of time talking about their theatrical experiences. There's been a lot of sold-out showings for this film when it has been playing, and it just seems like people are going for this one.
There's going to be more talk around this one. And
There
I think
is.
that talk
There's going
is
to be more
going
conversation.
But not even just more conversations. I think those conversations are going to last longer than whatever conversations are had around Venom: The Last Dance, which is a movie that I think most people will probably forget about in about a few weeks. Regardless if you like the film or not. More people will be talking about Conclave, especially given the topicality of, as we'll talk about, we're in an election year. So that's going to be a huge talking point, especially in how it relates to that.
Yeah. There might be a little bit of a pushback to what you're saying as it relates to Venom, but I'm going to hold that until we get to our review of Venom. But mostly you are correct. Right now, there's going to be more conversation around Conclave because, one, it will linger on into award season. So that alone will have this film top of mind for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Now, how far it goes is up in the air. We'll see if it's able to get a couple of Oscar nominations, but it's going to be in the conversation. But additionally to that, as you're talking about there, Brennan, with this little thing called the United States presidential election happening in just a few days' time as we are recording this. We're about a week out.
It's a week. Yeah.
1 week from today. All hell will break loose. Who knows if we'll even be a country in another week?
The podcast will end. The podcast will be there will be some new law that doesn't allow us to do this anymore.
Yeah. If there are any laws, we might just be living in a lawless country.
You mean a purge?
In another 7 days' time. But until then, with the election on the horizon, this film very clearly is tapping into the anxiety and the politicking that goes into election season. So yes, this is going to be a film that is going to be talked about. It is currently being talked about quite a lot right now. So I wanted to prioritize this one. That's why we're releasing this one first. Yeah. I'm also excited to get into this because Edward Berger came onto the scene a few years ago. Was that 2 years ago with All Quiet?
2022, I think it was. Yeah, I can double check that just to make sure that we're, correct in assuming that, but that's what I think it was.
Yeah, 2022.
2022, that's correct.
Yeah, so that film went on to be nominated for several Oscars.
I think it was nominated for like 7, and it won 4 of them, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, and it won, I believe it won 4. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it was very successful, obviously. And at that time, we were new to him as a filmmaker. He had done some films previously, but it wasn't like he wasn't on our radar at all. But I really liked that film a lot. It was, I'm pretty sure that was in my top 10 of that year. If not, it was certainly bordering.
It was,
it was top 10 for me.
It was top 20 for me, maybe top 25 at worst. But you're right that Edward Berger has been directing even before All Quiet on the Western Front, but it almost felt like a debut of sorts.
Yeah, and in a lot of ways, at least for us here in the United States. And
it was a discovery.
I did look at my list here. It was number 8 on my list for that year. I quite loved it. And I think partially because of how powerful and how resounding that film was, it in a lot of ways, it did feel like a debut film.
Yeah.
So at the very least, it got him on our radar. He is back now with Conclave, a very different film, but one certainly worth digging into here with Conclave. So with all of that laid out, Brennan, are you ready to get into this film?
This will be fun. This is going to be fun.
I think so. All right. So, yes, Conclave is directed by Edward Berger. It stars Ray Fiennes, Stanley Tucci, John Lithgow, Sergio Castellitto, Isabella Rossellini has a small role here. I also want to note, I still struggle to pronounce the name, but he also is working with the same composer. And I love the music. Loved the music to All Quiet on the Western Front.
I did
maybe
too.
We'll get into the score here with Conclave as well.
Let's just say this. It's prominent.
It is.
It's there.
Yeah, front and center. Yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
If you're not familiar with Conclave, when Cardinal Lawrence is tasked with leading one of the world's most secretive and ancient events, selecting a new pope, he finds himself at the center of a conspiracy that could shake the very foundation of the Catholic Church. All right, Brendan, lay it on me. What did you think about Conclave?
That plot synopsis makes it sound more like a church movie than what this actually is. This is an election movie. That is exactly what this movie is. This is 12 Angry Popes, as many people have already alluded to. That is the basis of this. And we should also clarify, you and I are going into this movie experiencing this essentially for the first time. This is based on a novel by Robert Harris that you and I
which
have
I've not read.
Yeah. But from what I understand, it is a very popular novel. It's partially why I think the film has been doing pretty well financially, at least given its budget. The fact that we were talking about a lot of sold out showings. The showing I went to, which was, I think it was on like a Sunday morning / early afternoon, it was sold out. It was a sold out showing. And I think a lot of it is maybe due to the popularity of that book. So I do know that maybe it does have its fans, and they're going to be curious about how this movie represents that and may be surprised to see that that same story is really being used as sort of a catalyst to talk about our own sociopolitical climate, just utilizing the Catholic Church as sort of a cipher for that is really what this is doing. And I do find that pretty interesting. I think it's a pretty riveting movie. I do think this is a very good film. I do like All Quiet on the Western Front more, primarily because I just responded more to Edward Berger's filmmaking in that one. This movie's a little bit more reserved, and for the most part, rightfully so. But there is actually kind of a biting sense of humor to this movie that did take me by surprise. And I think a lot of that is also due to Peter Straughan's script writing. I think it's actually really quite clever at times. The film almost has this aura of what feels like what would have happened if maybe any filmmaker were to adapt an airplane novel. You know, those airplane novels that are meant to be very thrilling, almost schlocky kind of reads. This almost feels like it was the basis for something like that. And some of those biting lines of dialogue are the things I appreciated the most. It was to the point where I found myself thinking about that little bit of news we had some weeks ago that Edward Berger might be tapped to do Ocean's 14. Remember that news from some weeks ago, which I don't know if it's still true or not. I still am not for that, but coming out of Conclave, I'm less against it than I was before because there is a little bit of fun to this movie that I found kind of interesting. Of course, it's very topical. There's more we'll talk about given what it's actually trying to suggest. It's going to get people talking. We'll simply say that. Do you think we should get into spoilers when we get to that point in the conversation? Should we get into some details?
We can if you need to.
I don't know if I need to.
There is certainly a reveal at the end of the film that is, I'm not sure how to articulate it, but it is, it adds additional context to the drama.
It certainly adds something to the movie. And if we want to get into the specifics, it might be and we'll see how the conversation goes if we need to go there, but it might be fun to get into those specifics given where the film does end up. But I did really enjoy it. I found the script writing really, really taut here. And the performances certainly do fit the mold and really adding something to this material.
Yeah, absolutely. And to reiterate, I did go into this somewhat ignorant because I am not at all familiar with the novel. So
yeah.
Any of my thoughts here, keep that in mind. But
yeah,
I did quite love this film. I'm not sure if this was the original intent of the novel, but the film ends up being this scathing reflection of the American political system as much as it is holding up a mirror to the contradictory nature of religion and one's innate thirst for power. I don't know if it is accidental, again, in terms of the novel. As far as Berger and his intentions, I don't think that was at all accidental. There are too many parallels to be drawn when you consider how religion is inextricably interwoven with American politics, with one party turning God into an agenda and using it as a cipher for appalling behavior, all spearheaded by a man who wants to take us back to a time that is less progressive and more segregated. That is very much the nucleus of Conclave. The setting and location might be different, but under the falsehood of unity is a war raging between progressive inclusion and conservative divide, with Cardinal Tedesco symbolically tapping into a MAGA mentality where he talks about the church needing to go back to an older, more traditional approach, abandoning the idea of coexistence. Not to mention his behavior is, let's say, quite problematic at times in this film. But despite his seemingly wretched ethos, he's one of the frontrunners to be named the next pope. As a result, there is a desperate pushback from Cardinal Bellini and Cardinal Lawrence and others who are deeply aware of what's at stake and the progressive values that will be lost if Tedesco wins the papacy. So the political nuances of this film are pretty vivid. There's not a whole lot of subtlety to it.
Oh, it's not hiding that. No, it's
not hiding that.
No, but there's an interesting subtext to it that I'll respond to, but I'll let you finish your thoughts first.
Where I might differ from a lot of people when it comes to this film, at least given the sentiment I've seen on social media, I didn't find it nearly as melodramatic as a lot of other people did.
Oh,
even
interesting.
though it is full of these riveting twists and turns, and I get it. In a lot of ways, it does feel theatrical. And maybe my own experiences inside the church are coloring my viewpoint in terms of that melodrama, but the ruthless ambition and the thirst for dominance that we see in this film is just as prominent in the religious space as it is the political space. The idea of these older men vying for power and demonstrating faux humility is as real as apple pie. And I think this film treats it with the sincerity and absurdity it deserves, which is where it thrives, especially thanks to these great performances. So I do agree there's fun to be had with this film. The drama is riveting.
Yeah.
There is a tinge of melodrama here, but I don't think it goes nearly as far as people are claiming it to be. I think there is a lot of sincerity And if anything, the film wants to highlight how insane it is, the lengths people are willing to go to when it comes to vying for power and the things they're willing to let go, the looseness of reality in particular, how that is at the core of somebody, all because, or all in the name of trying to get to a certain throne. And how that comes through in terms of commentary or thematic nuance, I found it registering more on that level than crazy, insane, Gone Girl like melodrama, if that makes sense.
Well, no, it does make sense. And this is why I don't like to use the word melodrama or even melodramatic to describe things in movies anymore, because I think it's a word that gets thrown around a lot and sometimes it's misused. In fact, not even sometimes, I think it's often misused. Because in the case of a movie like Conclave, I think it has maybe the tonality of what could be perceived as melodrama, especially given some of the biting humor that exists here, some of the film's, physical eccentricities. A lot of the musical score is certainly giving a melodramatic vibe to it. But the thing with melodrama is that a movie's narrative also needs to work alongside that tonal melodrama, which is why you made a comparison to a movie like David Fincher's Gone Girl. Narratively, that movie is very melodramatic. That's a melodrama through and through. But the narrative mechanics of a movie like Conclave, I wouldn't call melodramatic. I do think there is a sense of realism here. It just it presents itself at times in a way that could be perceived as melodramatic because it's heightening that absurdity that you're talking about.
Which is where, and sorry to cut in real fast, but I think this is an appropriate place for it. I I really like the rendition, the melodies of Volker Bertelmann's score. I think on its own terms, outside the context of the film, it's a banger. It's really great. In context of the film, I think it does maybe feel misplaced at times. Because
I don't think it works nearly as well here as it did with All Quiet on the Western
I
Front.
agree. And that's where it's a double-edged sword, because I do find myself listening to this outside of the film going, oh my God, yes, give me all of this. But I think given the film's tone and the way it treats faith with sincerity in terms of grappling with one's faith, which I obviously want to talk more about, the film does not treat that with any sort of melodrama. If anything, there might be a heightening, again, of the absurdity, the lengths people are willing to go to, how they're willing to turn themselves into clowns, for the lack of a better term, all for the sake of this throne. There is a heightening of that, but again, I agree with you. I think it is foundationally more rooted in a realism than melodrama, especially if you take the music out of the film altogether. When you consider the performances and
it's a very different movie. If you take the music out,
but as soon as you introduce that score, then all of a sudden I feel like it starts to channel something that the film really isn't. So that's where I would criticize the score here. I don't think it is nearly as seamless in that regard. The music, again, on its own,
music's good on its own,
but it's not interwoven well in the film, I don't think.
Well, and I'm not sure what the best direction would have been, if the music should have been maybe toned back to match the film itself. But at the same time, I like that there's something here that maybe creates a more literal depiction of that absurdity in a way that does feel kind of biting and funny. So then maybe should Edward Berger as a filmmaker heighten his filmmaking tactics to maybe match it a little bit? It could. I think one or the other probably should have happened. I think with a movie like All Quiet on the Western Front, there was a beautiful synergy between all of these different filmmaking components coming together to match that film's goal. And if I have any real criticisms with a movie like Conclave, I do think there's a little bit more of a disconnect between some of those attributes in the filmmaking. I think overall it's a very well-made film, but with this really heightened score and then a director like Edward Berger almost playing things a little bit more reserved by comparison to something like All Quiet on the Western Front, and then some of these performances giving, certainly giving credence to the film's drama, but then at times being sometimes pretty bitingly hilarious. There are a few lines from Stanley Tucci that made me laugh quite out loud. There are moments like that, and sometimes it does feel like there's a slight disconnect between all of these things. So it doesn't make it as smooth of an experience as All Quiet on the Western Front was. But at the same time, I do like that there is a heightening of some of these things that do have a sense of realism to them because it's meant to showcase that absurdity. I just want to make sure that when we talk about that, we're not calling the film melodramatic, because I think that's a very different thing.
Yeah, the only reason I feel like that is even a talking point is because of the score. I do think that is a misguided approach that
that's fair.
Does suffocate the film a little bit in that regard, or at least it treats the material in a way that I think undermines what it's really aiming for. That aside, though, and you can't really ignore it. I think that's why I wanted to bring it up early on in this conversation, because the score, as you noted in your opening thoughts, it is prominent.
It's very much there. You can't ignore it. Yeah,
it is quite prominent. And while it did perhaps take me out slightly for the reasons we mentioned, the music itself is so good that I found myself still compelled by the music. I just don't think it works with the drama for the reasons we've been talking about. That said, though, I do think I was I was able to get past it, because I do love what the film is doing in terms of its faith with its characters, its drama, and how all of that is a cipher for the themes that we've been talking about. That I do think is mostly well handled here. And I do want to talk about the film's faith, but as far as some of the dialogue and the writing here and the performances, again, where I think that is more seamless than it isn't in this film.
Yeah.
Like where the humor comes through, I think, is almost exclusively because of the performers and how they deliver the dialogue, and not how the film is treating that material.
Perhaps.
Stanley Tucci, for example, Stanley Tucci is a really great actor, and he is able to deliver sharp, biting lines of dialogue in a way that can come off comedically, because he has great skill sets that allow him to really channel dialogue in that way. Cardinal Bellini, though, as a character, is the character in this film that understands the stakes the most.
He's the sympathetic
is not taking this.
Yeah,
he is not taking this lightly at all. He is deeply serious about this election and understands what is at stake, and wants to make sure that if it's not him, that someone else is able to take the papacy away from Tedesco. Even if that comes at the behest of, well, we got to pick the lesser of the evils, which is
such a literal line.
Yes. And again, how that perhaps taps into American
that's
politics.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah, it's very literal. And when I say it that way, I don't mean that as a criticism. I'm kind of laughing at the almost timely nature of that line.
Yes, it's extremely timely, for sure. But Bellini as a character is often reiterating to everyone else around him why we need to take this seriously. So if you just read the character on the page, there's absolutely nothing humorous about the character or the lines that he's delivering. You throw in a Stanley Tucci, though, and he's able to take that dialogue and at times give it a burst of energy, because he's just that great of an actor. And I think that distinction needs to be made. And why, again, I go back to this film treating this material with more sincerity than melodrama, because it is. It is. And where things might, I guess, loosen itself a little bit will come through and these performers and how they perhaps tap into some of that dialogue. And I do appreciate that. I do appreciate that the film isn't completely, it's not too much of a stringhold on the material. It's not trying to shove it down the audience's throats or anything of the sort. the film does want to have a little bit of fun while demonstrating the absurdity of what these characters are trying to attempt. And again, not just in terms of the Conclave experience, but more broadly speaking, as it relates to American politics or even just the corporate power struggle that we see in not just America, but throughout the world as well.
Yeah.
There's a lunacy to it. And this film wants to convey that in a way that, again, gives credence to the characters and the emotions that they're experiencing, while also recognizing, again, that lunacy.
Yeah, well, I think that's what made Stanley Tucci's performance so compelling. He might be the MVP here for me, although, I mean, I do love Ralph Fiennes here. I think his performance, and at least the writing of Cardinal Lawrence, is perhaps the most complicated one to maneuver around. So I think in many ways, Ralph Fiennes has perhaps the most challenging role here. Rightfully so. He is front and center throughout all of this, but Stanley Tucci, when I say I found him funny, it's more so given the character that he plays, Bellini. It's more to do with his own self-awareness of what's at hand, because he delivers his awareness of these stakes in an almost sarcastic kind of way to really emulate the importance of it, but also is very serious and sincere in that execution. At least he is at first, until, when the stakes really start to rise, that's where you notice a shift in that character. So he's not giving a comedic performance. There's a difference between it being, kind of self-aware and funny because of how, absurd that he recognizes that it is, as opposed to giving a comedic performance. He's certainly not doing that. Really, the only moment in the film that I would say is borderline straight up comedic, and perhaps the wrong ways, and it actually garnered the biggest laugh in the entire theater for me, it actually came from Isabella Rossellini. And it's a moment where she all but reveals something regarding another certain character in this cafeteria.
You're talking about the moment near the end when she bursts into the room when all of the drama is unfolding. And
then she bows and then leaves.
Yeah.
The bow got the entire theater cackling for what felt like 30 minutes. But I think that's the moment where it felt like it was veering too close into something that tonally was a bit almost goofy. Like, I think that was the one that maybe didn't quite work. But there is so much about what Stanley Tucci is doing that is almost, I don't want to say meta, but that self-awareness is what I think makes him such a compelling presence on screen here, especially knowing what's at stake.
That's interesting. I had such a different crowd reaction to that moment.
Really?
Yeah, my crowd did not laugh at that. If anything, it was the antithesis. Well, maybe not quite the antithesis, but it was very different in the sense that it was mostly grunts in agreement of the moment, understanding the thematic power of her intervening the way she does there.
Well, let me be clear. It's not her intervening, because her projection and her forcefulness was not the thing that was funny. It was the bow. That was what made people laugh.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's what I'm talking about. Yeah.
Okay, I mean, just making sure that we were in line.
The whole interaction.
Okay.
There was no laughter in my crowd. If anything, it was a lot of people just shaking their heads, and again, like grunts and an agreement of and understanding what the bow means. At least that's how I interpreted the people around me, because that's how they reacted to the moment.
Yeah.
We had very different theatrical reactions to that, which I think is interesting.
And maybe it could just be like it was maybe awkwardly edited or something like that. Maybe it was less to do with the fact that she exited the room in that way, and maybe just more to do with how it was interwoven within the flow of the movie, that maybe it just came off that way and was read that certain way. So I'm not really sure, but that was weirdly the reaction to everyone in the theater when that happened.
Well, and again, I think maybe that's where you go back to the performance of it all, because there's not much in this film that I found outwardly comedic or over the top or melodramatic, as we've been talking about. What I do find interesting about the bow, and I didn't really think too much of it in the moment, other than it was certainly perhaps a sarcastic gesture on her part that is
Yeah.
complementary to why she's barging in there in the first place and delivering that specific dialogue that she does. She does want to undermine a certain individual in that room. And she does it in a way that is, that conveys a little bit of prowess.
Yeah.
And
there's
that
a cocky
sarcasm,
forcefulness almost to it. And I think maybe that's what people responded to.
Yeah. And I think the bow to me is perhaps a little bit of a cherry on top that
it's kind of like a middle finger in some ways, right?
Yeah. Which inherently doesn't have to be funny. It can be a little bit of more of like a fist in the air gesture, or in terms of the tone of what is being delivered there. That I think like, to me, I think tonally meshes well with the rest of the film and how much of this could be perceived. I think that character, I know a lot of people have been talking about this as well, to have her more in the film would have been interesting. I don't know if the film calls for it, but what she means as far as a contrast to the rest of these guys, I do think is quite compelling.
Oh yeah.
Would have given the film a little bit more texture that I would have been interested to see.
I think that's a fair point. I think maybe it's easy to latch onto that as a potential criticism if that character weren't played by someone like Isabella Rossellini. Just the fact that we gravitate towards her as such a leading lady and such a strong presence on screen, we might find ourselves wanting more of her just because we selfishly love her as an actress.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's like I was also watching the film thinking of, this is an odd example because they're very different films, but the comp I'm about to make is with Robert Altman's Gosford Park, which was very deliberately trying to showcase the difference in that polarity between the rich and wealthy upstairs and then the help downstairs. And there is very much a distinction between the women and the men. Like, this film is depicting that. But maybe we get more of one side than the other. So it's not that literal division that we saw in a movie like Gosford Park to showcase those social class differences, right? So like still at this point, the character that Isabella Rossellini is playing, Sister Agnes, I still don't really know a whole lot about her, but I'm not to your point, I'm not really sure if the movie calls for it. It's just selfishly, when you have a great actress like that, you want to see more of her.
And
you want to see her shoot the scenery.
It's the few scenes that she's in the film, she's really great and provides she provides an energy that is so different from the rest of the film, and this vying for power that I do find wonderfully subversive in the film. So yeah, I understand the idea of wanting her more in the film, but simultaneously, given what the film is narratively and dramatically, if you shoehorn her into the film, I don't know how effective that would be in from a writing perspective.
Sure.
But yeah, she is really great. And so selfishly, I agree, like, having her would have been really compelling. I do want to talk a little bit more about the way this film manifests faith among the film's drama, because that is another element that I do think is part of the nucleus of this film. It's ultimately why, some of the potential one-liners in this film, how that could be perceived as funny, or the bow that you're talking about there, from Rossellini's character, Sister Agnes, and how that could also be perceived as a comedic moment. I think part of the reason I didn't perhaps go to those lengths as far as the tone of the film goes, I think it kind of circles back to how the film treats faith. Because the idea of these men vying for power and undermining each other, again, as I noted in my opening thoughts, I find that so tonally believable. But on the other side of the coin, I do think there is a deep sincerity here to how this film treats the wavering faith of Cardinal Lawrence specifically. This is a man who doesn't know what to believe anymore. He notes at the beginning of the film he wanted to resign, but the previous pope did not accept his resignation for reasons he comes to find out as the film unfolds. He literally becomes the accidentally became at work meme, which I do find funny outside the context of the film.
That's a good one.
But he does his job with conviction, despite the Pope not accepting his resignation. He does the job with conviction. He takes it very seriously. If he sees something wrong, he calls it out, even when that comes at the cost of two, not one, but two front runners losing votes, which could be and is often perceived as Lawrence wanting the papacy himself. But we know that's not the truth. The man may not have much faith left, yet he's seemingly the only one here willing to truly reconcile with what faith is supposed to mean. That's why his speech as the conclave is beginning is so incredibly moving, where he says that certainty is the enemy of tolerance. If there was only certainty and no doubt, there would be no mystery and therefore no need for faith. Let's pray that God grants us a pope who doubts.
It's funny you say that. I had that line written down in my notes as well, because I knew we were going to reference it.
That is such an evocative moment in this film. And I love how it truly, genuinely wants to wrestle with the meaning of faith. And Ray Fiennes, his performance is stunning. It is tantalizing to me because for all of the perceived melodrama here, or at, the vying for power, how these individuals are wanting to undermine each other at all costs, here is a man, Cardinal Lawrence, who does not care about any of that other than calling out the bullshit for what it is, because he's a man that just wants to get to the truth. He wants to wrestle with faith in a real way, in a real, genuine, honest way that none of these other characters care to do. And the film tonally treats that also with fervent sincerity. And because he is our protagonist here, he's the character that we follow throughout this movie, he is the nucleus of it. That to me is why the melodrama isn't felt for me. I don't find the drama here manufactured when we follow him throughout this film.
Right.
And he is truly grappling with God and faith, and why this process seemingly wants nothing to do with who they are supposed to be as these cardinals within the Catholic Church. It's such a fascinating dichotomy that I do love. And it's why I think the film gets to have its cake and eat it too, in terms of the film acting as much as a reflection of religion and the contradictory nature that comes with that particular process within the Catholic Church. It is very much that. This film is very much that because of Lawrence and who he is here, as much as the film is, again, accidentally or not, it becomes this reflection on the American political system as well, which is so timely, obviously. But I think the film is able to have both. And honestly, that one to me was the best part of this film. Like all of the vying for power and what these characters do to each other. Sure, there's fun to be had there. And I enjoyed that as much as everyone else. But I don't think that's what makes this film what it is. It is Ray Fiennes. No. It is Cardinal Lawrence. And that particular struggle, that I think is fully realized here in a way that is deeply poignant and redolent. And I loved every moment of that.
Yeah. Well, where I think the film would have perhaps gone the more melodramatic route, or maybe even more of a psychodrama related route, is if, let's say, Cardinal Lawrence, through all of these machinations, sort of found himself, kind of succumbing to that quest for power, just like everyone else. Because as a person, he's got to act as this mediator of sorts to drive this conclave to get to that final result. Yet at the same time, people are still voting for him, even though he's meant to be this mediator. Like I said, he's also someone that like everyone else, doesn't want to be swayed by what's happening in the outside world because he doesn't want that to sway anyone's decision. Yet at the same time, he knows things are happening in the outside world. So like he's running this risk of being accused of playing the political game, even though we know he's not doing that. But let's say if hypothetically that character were to fall into those trappings, then I think calling this more melodramatic would have been a fair criticism, but it doesn't do that. He straddles the line in a very humanistic way, which is what I do love about Ralph Fiennes' performance, and why earlier in this conversation I called it perhaps the trickiest role of anyone here, because he has to straddle all of those lines simultaneously, and we know where his true motivations lie, given that really great homily you referenced earlier. I think it is a great quotable sermon that people really should reference.
It's great.
I think it's a great thing.
Yeah, I completely agree. I love what he has to say there about certainty and doubt and why that is important as it relates to faith. And it is indicative of who he is and a lot of the choices he makes throughout this film, because as the events of it unfold, and some of it does get a little rambunctious in terms of the drama. Again, I can understand why people perceive it as melodrama, even though I don't fully agree myself.
Right.
But as those moments unfold, he maintains his grounded approach to faith and certainty, or the lack thereof. Two examples to help illustrate what I'm talking about here and why I love this character. And maybe, honestly, this is a great point where we can transition to spoilers, because I do want to reveal these two characters as it relates to this specific idea. Maybe we can do slight spoilers here, and then as we get into the ending, we can go full on into it. But I at least want to reveal these two characters. So slight spoilers here. But there are two moments in this film that I find striking. One of them is with Cardinal Ademi, who is a Nigerian social conservative, economic progressive cardinal. And initially, he is the front runner, right? He gets upwards of, I think, 54 votes or something along those lines.
Yeah.
Which alludes to, when we get to the next round of voting, he's likely going to get the majority of votes.
The majority of 72, I think, is what they need, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
So in between the rounds of voting, there's a lunch break, and something happens where a Nigerian worker, a female worker, is serving him lunch. There's some sort of mishap in the kitchen, or not in the kitchen, but in the mess hall area. And as we come to find out, they had a relationship, Cardinal Ademi and this woman. They had an inappropriate relationship some years ago.
He was 30 and she was 19, I think.
Yeah. And it was 20 years ago at the time, where all of this is taking place. So, not great, obviously, but something that had happened, quite distantly in the past. So because of this, Cardinal Lawrence is very open and honest with Ademi. Hey, look, people are going to talk. This is now out in the open. You're not going to win the Pope. You're not going to be the next Pope.
Yeah.
He's very honest with them, but he does it in a loving way. Because again, this is a man, speaking of Lawrence, that is genuinely trying to figure out who he is now, and what his faith means to him. So as he has this moment, instead of the film acting as melodrama, again, if we're going to compare it to something like Gone Girl, where you have the slashing of the throat and you have the two characters at the end kind of posing each other.
This is a political
opposite.
scandal. This is just a political scandal that we've seen countless times.
Yeah, but tonally, and this film had every opportunity on a tonal level to match a Gone Girl, or if you want to get really extreme with it, a May December. But this film refuses to do that. Instead, this is a genuine, sincere moment where Edeme realizes that he will never become the Pope because of this scandal, this mistake that he made 25, 30 years ago. It happened a long time ago, but it's still not okay. And it's not, it's going to be something that keeps him from becoming Pope. So they have a genuine connection where they sit down and they pray together. And I think like the way Lawrence treats him in that moment says so much about him. And I think it says a lot about the film and what it is attempting to be as a movie. And I feel the same way with the way Lawrence treats Tremblay. Now, what happens with Tremblay is admittedly a little bit more outlandish, right? Especially because Lawrence, he wants to expose this because it's not okay. And Tremblay is playing the political game and trying to undermine, keep this a secret. And he's lying and he's, you know, he's doing the politics thing. So Lawrence he makes a gesture. He prints out, you know, the material, as everyone on social media has demonstrated. It's very akin to that moment in Mean Girls where we're just
it's the burn book. It's the burn book. Yeah.
Exactly.
The Catholic burn book.
Exactly. And so look, everyone, you know, is aware. It's all exposed. It's out in the open. And again, I don't think Lawrence does that to create drama and
he does it because he thinks it's right. And he also but he also knows that just given historically how scandals work within any political system, if that person who is the subject of said scandal ends up taking the throne, then that's going to be a target on that person's back. And that's not going to look good for this establishment either. So he understands just the repercussions of that.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. It all comes back to a man wrestling with his faith. What is the right thing to do? And look, he could have taken Bellini's advice and burned the papers and let Tremblay become the next pope. But to your point, does that lead to further ramifications later? Does that make the church as a whole look worse in future years to come? The answer to that is likely yes, probably yes. And this is a film that recognizes the church's mistakes, including its sexual scandals. The film very much brings that up as a talking point or a fear that we don't want this to happen again. So he does what he thinks is the right thing to do because he is grappling with his faith and he wants to treat that with sincerity. And he doesn't judge Tremblay. He simply wants to get to the truth. And that's another moment where, again, in another film, he is manipulating Tremblay or making him look like a fool and embarrassing him, but that is never the intent. The intent is always to treat him with love and get to the truth. And so those two moments in this film, I think, are indicative of what this film is really trying to be about, the way it treats faith with sincerity as it relates to doubt and certainty and the lines that can be drawn, that are often drawn when it comes to these kinds of circumstances.
Well, and I think what makes the film more fascinating and even ironic in that depiction is how it treats that duty to do what's right within a system that has been more historically conservative, right?
And corrupt.
And I think that's what makes the movie fascinating and refreshing. And especially if you want to look at this as a quote unquote church movie, I think this is where it could invite a conversation to be had about what this means for these types of establishments, religious establishments going forward. And I think that's what's really interesting about the film and how people can take something away from that as far as where it is going. And if that's ultimately what they want to see in that.
Well, I completely agree. And that's why, you know, because I know a lot of people have been talking about this film from a political perspective.
Right.
And how it is timely to our political climate, the election coming up, and again, there's a lot of parallels to be drawn there for sure. And it is the film is very transparent in that regard. But I think simultaneously, this is a film that wants to grapple quite provocatively with faith and how traditional values aren't necessarily
the best.
The word? Yeah, well, yeah, the best, sure.
I'm oversimplifying it for you. I know that.
Well, I was trying to think of you're not wrong. You're not wrong, but those values aren't necessarily in alignment with what faith is meant to be foundationally.
Right. It's recognizing that sometimes that faith, things change depending on worldwide circumstances, and this is a film that recognizes sometimes these establishments need to play up with that change of pace, right? Staying too stuck in a traditional mentality keeps you behind the times. And this is definitely recognizing that.
Yeah, the film is, from a theological perspective, it is quite provocative, and I think very stirring, and notions it wants to bring up in terms of how progressive values are arguably more in line with what Christian faith was always meant to be. This is a film that wants to make that argument.
It is, yeah, and this is why I want to be careful how I say this, because I don't know if other people maybe have a different interpretation of how this film treats really Catholicism specifically, because it is the main cipher for these ideas. But I don't see the film as like a giant middle finger to Catholicism in a way. Like, I actually do see it as looking at it in a way that there is hope for this type of more conservative establishment, that it is perhaps going to be moving forward in the right direction. And as someone like myself that has grown up Catholic, I am even seeing that as well. So I think, if anything, this is maybe showcasing where things are perhaps moving, and where this movie is arguing that it wants to see things move.
Yeah.
I think there is a sense of hope here.
Yeah. Look, I did not grow up Catholic, and I don't say this to undermine Catholicism at all.
Right.
But this film works wonderfully from a broad perspective in terms of Christianity at large.
Sure.
Because the fundamental issues that this film is raising, and again, that provocative philosophy as it relates to theology that I'm referencing goes far beyond just Catholicism. I've seen this
absolutely
in all types of Christendom.
It's any denomination that has some type of structure or some type of establishment.
Yeah, like, because that troublesome conservative ideal that is representative here in the Tedesco character.
Yeah.
That, again, in terms of the American political system, we all know what that's representative as well.
Right.
Like, that whole idea is not just outdated, but in contrast with what true faith in Christianity is supposed to be. This film is wanting to raise the argument that those progressive values are more in alignment with
more humanistic,
what the text is and what faith actually is. Which is why, and this is a great transition as we get to the Cardinal Benitez character. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly, but this is a character.
Benitez, I believe they call him.
Benitez? Yeah, something along
played by
those lines.
Carlos Dietz.
So
I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right. I severely apologize.
Yes, very much so. The symbolism of this character is really quite biting, especially in regards to this specific part of the conversation. Again, I'm not sure how subtle it is, but sometimes you need to be allowed to get your message heard. This is a man who resides in Kabul, does a lot of his work in Afghanistan and the Congo, as he talks about, where Christianity is not the dominant religion. It's a land where he sees a lot of violence and bloodshed. he is not at all interested in politics or vying for power.
Yeah.
And then we get those reveals at the end of the film with who he was born to be that give him even more meaning as it relates to those progressive values that we're alluding to. And he says something at the end of the film that I think is really insightful, where he just says, I am what God made me. And I think that line, in the context of the American ethos of politics and religion, because those two things, again, are interlinked deeply, foundationally. I am what God made me, I think is the film perhaps at its most transparent as far as what its themes are going to be. And again, it's not subtle.
No, and perhaps that's where I think some people might perceive it as melodrama because it is so on the nose, given what those reveals are.
Perhaps. But again, I go back
nowadays,
to
it's not too outside the realm of possibility, though. So
no. And it is a bit of, look, it's a little bit of a swing in terms of the twists and turns of the film. It
treats it like a twist ending, so like it could come off that way.
But again, I think it's necessary given that this is a film that wants to wrestle with faith in a sincere way, that wants to raise this idea that progressive values are more in alignment with what faith should look like. And here is a character that really pushes that to an extreme that I don't think is out of line given the tone of this film and what it is trying to be as a movie. And I love that last line where he says, I know what it is to exist between the world's certainties. I mean, that is a hell of a line. Like the writing in this film, I think, is extremely thoughtful and provocative. And I love that the film wants to be challenging in that regard. This is something you said on the main show, I believe, Brendan.
Yeah.
That a lot of people will see this and they'll be extremely upset. And you're completely right. There's going to be a sect of people that watch this and are extremely offended by where this goes, especially given that final reveal. But given what this film is as a thematic exercise, I love that the film is willing to go to these places.
Overall, I think I like the ending. If I have any reservations, it comes into one major faction here. I'll get to that in just a sec. But what I do like about that conclusion and really the what of that final reveal that maybe we don't need to give it away. I feel like we're dancing around it just enough that we don't necessarily need to get into those specifics and ruin the fun for anyone, right? But I like that the film is very abrasively going there to prove that point across, as you're saying, so I can defend it in that way. If I have any, like I said, I don't want to say reservations, where I'm scratching my head over it, I do wonder if it is a little bit thematically redundant. Because so much of what we see with Benitez leading up to that moment, that great monologue he has in this, what looks like a movie theater of sorts after a physical act of violence is incurred on this establishment.
Yeah.
He delivers this great monologue about his experience, about fighting for what's in here as opposed to fighting for power, and also the context of where he came from, the small congregation that he leads, and the fact that he is also Mexican. I think there are all these sprinklings here that really push this idea of a more progressive-minded approach to this establishment. That when we get to that ending, I don't know if it really offers any more on that outside of just screaming it more loudly, if that makes sense. But maybe the argument is it needs to scream it loudly, which is where I could simultaneously defend it. It's just like, I do think there is also a bit of a redundancy in those themes, because I think the movie was all about those things already. I don't know if I necessarily needed it to scream, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I don't think you're wrong necessarily. That speech that you're talking about there after the bombing takes place, it is very indicative of how he is the other side of the coin to Colonel.
It kind of sums up the movie in some ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Like it's very clear that his values, his alignings are anti-MAGA, anti-Tedesco, and you couple it with the context that yes, he's working in Kabul, he's working in the Congo. You don't preach Catholicism and Christianity in those places unless you truly believe in your faith,
Right.
because it is going to be dangerous, and he is working where and not just that it's dangerous, but he is seeing the violence firsthand, which means he's going to be interacting with people who have succumbed to that violence in some way, shape, or form, physically or mentally or spiritually. And that idea certainly comes through in the moment, in the speech alone. I do agree with you that in terms of the distancing between those two characters and what we're really voting for here, it's crystal clear. What we get at the end, I do think just kind of takes it to an extreme, like takes it to a new level as far as what it means to be in this position, and not just be in this position, but hold power. Because, and again, maybe spoiler alert here, like where this film ends with Benitez in relation to power, and again, a character that did not seek it out, that wasn't vying for power. It's something that came to him, and how that is Christ-like in those parallels. I find that fascinating to go to those extremes, especially when you look at the text itself. And now I'm kind of getting outside the realm of the film here a little bit, but
I get you.
When I think about the text, when I think about who Jesus was and the things he did in relation, like in context of the government that he would have been surrounded by, the laws of the land at that time, everything Jesus did was extreme. That's why they wanted to kill him. That's why they wanted to kill him. And not just extreme, but in a clever way would point at the hypocrisy of the Pharisees, which is what I love so much about Luke 15, for example, which is my favorite chapter in the text, where he just, like, to their faces, he points out the hypocrisy to the Pharisees. He was very bold. And I love that this film wants to channel that energy. The film isn't getting into that specifically, not directly here, but the symbolism of Benitez and going to those lengths does channel the extremes and the energy of the Christ in the text. And so from that perspective, I do find the film provocative and what it wants to raise as far as those questions, especially when you consider in our time how Christ is funneled through conservative MAGA mentalities, which is often, in my opinion, extremely misguided and just wrong.
Well, yeah, and that's why I'm having a hard time criticizing maybe the redundancy of that final twist, thematically speaking, because if there ever is a narrative that maybe calls for a little bit more of that abrasive representation of what came before it, maybe it is something like this, given the parallels that you're drawing. So maybe it is the right one. I'm still scratching my head over that, but I think there's certainly an intent in trying to, like, I actually think those parallels are pretty deliberate. I think the film is trying to find some common ground between the religious text and maybe how that relates to those final reveals that we get, given just the sheer extreme nature of them. I think it is trying to find some type of synergy there. So yeah, I think if there ever is a narrative that maybe has a right to get away with something like that, it is something like this.
I agree. And I think Edward Berger does a great job of weaving those threads pretty well from a tonal and writing perspective, because it might come off a little jarring, but I think again, given those parallels and what it's drawing from, I find that like it feels like a film that is doing some true, genuine soul searching.
Sure.
And I find that maybe ironic given what the conversation is around this film as it relates to how fun it is, and it's melodrama, and isn't this lunacy? And I guess it is those things, but I think more than anything else, this is a film in an existential crisis, and I freaking love that.
Well, yeah, it could be fun, it could be funny, it could be absurd. That doesn't mean it's melodramatic.
Yeah, I agree.
And again, I feel like if there is maybe a thesis we can take away from this, as far as just how our thoughts maybe relate to film criticism as a whole, I really want us to get away from the word melodrama, because like I said earlier, I do think it is getting dangerously misused nowadays.
Yeah,
I think
I agree.
Yeah, and I think this is an example of that. Like, this movie can be, it's heightened, it's absurd, like I said. That doesn't make it melodramatic. I think those are very different things.
I agree. And I think the heightening of certain things here is, again, just to point out the lunacy of these men vying for power when they're supposed to be humble servants of God. And yet, because we're all human, they want that position. They want to hold that power. So yeah, of course this film wants to call out the absurdity of that, but I think that's all that it is. You're right. It's short of melodrama. It's just calling out that irony. And there's a huge difference between the two, as far as I'm concerned.
And I also want to bring it up too, because in my opening thoughts, I did call attention to how much fun I had watching this, that it was very bitingly funny. I really appreciated the film's sense of humor. But I just want to make sure that I'm not conveying that I did think the film was melodramatic, because I don't think that's the same thing. It's just there's a certain tone and a heightened level of presentation here that I really did respond to, that made the film kind of fun. Like, I'm not going to go as far as to say that I think Edward Berger should make a comedy next, but like, he is dipping his toes at times into it that I thought did serve the movie and its absurd nature very well.
Yeah, I completely agree. As I noted, I think this is a film in existential crisis. I will die on that hill. I think that's what this film is more than anything else. But if it is melodrama, if it's lunacy, if this is Gone Girl trash, this is high-end gourmet trash. This is the best trash you can possibly find. This is the most provocative, soul-stirring trash that cinema has ever provided.
I mean,
I'll just articulate it that way, I guess.
Trash can be a good thing, but I don't know. I usually reserve the term trash for movies like maybe one that we'll talk about a little bit later during this week.
I agree. I agree. My definition of trash isn't clearly what it is for a lot of others that are talking about this film.
You know, again, another term that gets thrown around sometimes in a way that feels misused, I'd say.
I completely agree. And I think in this case, again, just my opinion, so take this for what it's worth, listeners, but I think in this case, melodrama and trash and those adjectives being thrown out for this film, I do think is misguided.
Perhaps.
I don't think that's at all what this film is. I don't even think it's close. Again, like, it amplifies certain things for sure, certain dramas, as we've been talking about. But this is a film that wants to wrestle with faith and what that really means, especially in the context of the modern age. And again, the ironies can be, I think maybe that's what it is. It's just that the ironies at play are so astounding. You can't wrap your mind around the lengths that some people are willing to go to. Like, they just don't live in reality, and they don't care to live in reality. They just want to.
It's the ridiculousness of it that people are latching. Yeah,
I think that's it. Like, I think it's so, like, some of that absurdity is so ridiculous that we just throw trash and melodrama at it, because that feels applicable when really, like, from a tone perspective and a soul searching perspective, that's just not what the film is doing.
I feel like it happens in one of two situations. If it's ever just heightening a certain ridiculous nature to prove a point like we were seeing here, or if we ever see a movie that's maybe, let's say a movie that's more comedically driven than, let's say, the type of movie that it normally would be. Like, if it's a movie that's maybe more of a thriller or a drama of some sort, and yet people find it to be a lot more bitingly hilarious, then it's easy to throw terms like melodrama at it or something like that. I think people are just doing that more often than they should be.
No, I completely agree. I mean, if you, I think a great maybe like exercise to do if you want to see if Conclave is melodrama, watch this next to something like May December or a Pedro Almodovar film, and then tell me how melodrama Conclave is. Because I guarantee you're going to come back and agree with me on this. You're like, oh, wait, never mind. Never mind. This film is not melodrama.
You just picked two films that came from different planets.
like you want melodrama. Those are great examples of melodrama in the best ways. I'm not. Yeah. Obviously, I love
Pedro Almodovar. Yeah, we love his work. But they are clearly melodramas. That is their intent.
Absolutely. Like he does that right. Like Edward Berger is not going for that at all. Like not even close.
No.
At any rate, that's Conclave. Any other thoughts on Conclave?
Well, that ends the melodramatic conversation on Conclave. I do like this movie. Yeah, and I'm curious to see how well it holds as far as not just box office wise, but I'm curious what the conversation among normies is going to be. Just those who go and see this movie because maybe they have a relationship to the book, maybe they're fans of the book, or they just have a sheer curiosity in something like this. I'm curious how it's going to spark a conversation between those of us who are not in our film critic circle. I kind of want to be a fly in the wall for that.
Yeah, I completely agree. And if you disagree with us regarding the film's tone, I would also love to hear your argument. Please reach out to us. If you're watching on YouTube, leave a comment below or hit us up on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, because I genuinely would love to hear everyone's thoughts on this film and where they land on it. But I will absolutely die on this hill that we've talked about here. So, but I do really like it as well. And look, I know I criticized it earlier. I still really like Bertelmann's score, though. I don't know if it works in context of the film, but on its own, it rules. It's really good.
Yeah.
So anyway, I just
it hits you like hits you like a bunch of knives when you hear it in that movie.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I loved it. Okay, well, with that, I guess we'll go ahead and wind down our conversation here on Conclave. As I noted, please let us know if you agree or disagree. You can always email us insessionfilm@gmail.com as well. Hit us up on Letterboxd. All right. As I noted, we'll have a review of Venom: The Last Dance coming as well. Episode 608 is available. We do a little catch-up episode talking about other 2024 films. We talk about Janet Planet. We talk about Strange Darling. What else do we talk about? Wolves. We talk about...
For like 2 minutes.
For like a minute and a half. We talk about other films that we've caught up with. We talk about the box office, of course. We get into Star Wars, the new Rey movie, maybe never coming out.
Maybe never.
It's a lot of fun. We get into all that fun stuff. So, at any rate, go and check out that show. Stay tuned for Venom. New Women in Session, and hopefully Chasing the Gold this week as well. With that, thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast. Conclave.
Melodrama.
Ray Fiennes, awesome in this movie.